Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Sarastro's Star Wars Shatterpoint painting series. In this video, I'll be batch painting the entire Clone Force 99 squad pack from the Star Wars Shatterpoint miniatures game by Atomic Mass Games. To help speed things along, I'll be using some sponge to achieve the main values and a nice bit of texture for all of the armour. We can then go in and paint the remaining details, such as the coloured markings, as well as the faces if you chose to leave the helmets off as I did. We'll also have a look at the colours I used for Omega, along with the various scenic elements, and as usual you can find chapter links to help navigate the video. Let's begin. Out of habit, I primed the whole squad in black, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights, although for the way we're going to paint them, a plain prime in grey or black would be fine. You could even use the airbrush to apply the first colour if you like, and I've chosen to apply some dark neutral grey to everything except for the heads, for Wrecker, Hunter, Crosshair and Echo. I'm also hitting the computer console with this. And if you'd like to really darken those recesses, we can go in with a dark wash. For that, I'm using Nuln Oil mixed with a little Drakenhof Nightshade. Next I'm going to tear off a small piece of regular kitchen sponge, which I'm then using to begin building up some texture and values. I'm starting with a reapplication of the dark neutral grey, which we can apply quite liberally. We can then begin increasing the values by mixing in some lighter tones. Either of these pro-aquarel mid-grey tones would be fine, or indeed a free mixture of the two. As this is still pretty dark, we can continue being fairly generous in our application. And for any parts that are tricky to reach with the sponge, we can just add some stipples and scratches with the brush instead. You can see I'm now adding more of the lighter midtones into the mix. And at some point you might want to shade the darker parts of the armour down with some of the dark neutral grey, although it's probably best to wait until we're finished with the sponge work. I'm now adding some brighter tones to the mix, and once again any combination of bright warm grey or bright neutral grey would be fine for this. Naturally, we want to be lighter in our application the brighter we go. I'm now just applying some of this lightish grey in a thin layer to Wrecker's chest piece to level out the contrast and integrate the look, whilst still allowing some of the underlying textures to show through. And once we're done with the sponge, we can go ahead and tidy up some of the darker inner suit areas with the dark neutral grey. Using the bright grey tones, I'm now adding some final sharp highlights, mainly to some of the corners and edges of the armour, along with some fine scratches. I'm also picking out the distinctive S-curve on Wrecker's chest. I'm using the same basic techniques for tech here, but starting with a mid-grey tone instead of the dark neutral grey. I also thinned the wash down somewhat with some Larmian medium so as not to overdarken things. And naturally I aimed for a much wider coverage with the lighter grey tones to capture his look. We can then go ahead and paint all of the areas of brown leather, and I'm using a mix of black brown and dark umber for this, followed with a little black lining. Returning to the armour, I'm now drawing on the various red markings, initially using some burnt red. This includes the red trim here on Echo's outfit. And we can add some rough highlights with the addition of some bold Pyrrole Red and something like tan flesh for the brightest spots. Once again aiming for a bit of a textured look here. We can also go back in with some of the grey armour tones to create more of a chipped appearance. Next I'm going to paint all of the faces using the same approach as detailed elsewhere in the series, including the recent video for Dengar. So typically I like to start with the whites of the eyes, followed with some black for the pupils and surrounding area. And I'm using my go-to Caucasian skin tones from the Scalecolor Artist range for the skin. There are some variations in the skin tones however. Notably Echo has a much more pale and greyish hue, so here I'm adding some white and a little black to my Caucasian base skin tone mix of pink flesh and burnt sienna umber. Regular viewers may remember that I also often like to incorporate a little Prussian Blue for the chin area. And I typically like to highlight up with a mix of golden flesh and pink flesh, sometimes leaning more towards one over the other, depending on how orange or pink I'd like the tone to be, and I'll add some vanilla white for the brighter highlights. I'm using a mixture of stippling and slightly thinned layers to achieve my blending here on Rekka's head. And for Echo's highlights, I chose to build up to a mix of pale skin and vanilla white. You could of course go with the helmets on option, I just happen to really enjoy painting faces. Here I chose to boost the saturation for some of Rekka's shadow and midtones with an orange glaze. I'm now mixing an off black, which I'm using to paint on Hunter's face markings. Moving on to the hair, for Hunter I'm starting with a base tone mix of black brown and dark umber. I'm then lightening things up with some light umber for the highlights. And something like vanilla white or ivory can be added for the brighter highlights. For crosshair, I'm providing a base tone of neutral grey mixed with a hint of Prussian Blue, brightened up with some bright neutral grey for the highlights. I'm also drawing on some eyebrows with a dark grey. And for tech, I'm starting with some light umber, then lightened up with some golden brown. And whilst we're here, I'm using the same colours to add some scratchy highlights to the brown leather. Moving on to Omega, I'm going to begin with the hair using golden brown darkened with a little light umber. Then simply lightening things with increasing amounts of vanilla white for the highlights. I'm now just mixing a dark grey for the headband with some black, white and a little Prussian blue. And now with a greater amount of white and blue for the highlights. I went back and forth a little with the light and dark tones. For the light parts of the top, I'm providing a base tone mix of warm grey and bright warm grey. And for the blue parts, I'm using blue-black mixed with a touch of jade. I'm now adding the red accents with some burnt red. Next I'm mixing some black with dark neutral grey for the legs and the belt. For the bow, I'm starting with a base tone mix of black brown and dark golden brown. And I'm using pure white for the bowstring and arrow tip. We can then highlight each of these areas, starting with the grey parts of the top, where I'm simply highlighting up to bright warm grey. And for the blue parts, I'm adding some grey blue to the base tone. Next I'm highlighting the legs and boots, initially up to dark neutral grey. And then adding some white to push the highlights on the boots as well as the details on the belt. For the bow and arrow, I'm beginning the highlights with some dark golden brown, which I'll then be lightening with some golden brown. As we move into the lighter tones, I'm focusing on the golden parts of the bow as well as the arrow. And I'm pushing the highlights up quite far with the addition of some bright ivory. I'm now using some bold Pyrrole Red to highlight the red accents. And I'm glazing some thinned neon pink over the bowstring and arrow tip. With Amiga complete, I'm now returning to finish off the rest. First I decided to clean up some of the weapons and accessories a little with a black and Prussian Blue mix, followed with a few sketchy highlights with the addition of some white. You can see I'm mainly using the side of the brush tip to quickly pick out these raised details. We can also highlight Tech's goggles. And for the lenses, I used a mix of dark golden brown and warm yellow. I then played around a little with the intensity of the yellow. We can also use the bluish grayscale to highlight Hunter's knife. And here I'm overbrushing a lightish grey tone over the metallic bits of the scenic terrain. We can then get progressively lighter. I'm now applying a wash of Nuln Oil and Drakenhof Nightshade. Followed with some additional highlights. You can see I'm playing with a combination of further dry brushing, edge highlighting, and some broader thin layers to adjust the values and tint. I'm also mainly dry brushing this debris. I'm now using a mix of golden brown and a little black brown, along with a touch of burnt orange to paint the masonry. Here I'm adding some additional golden brown. This can then be lightened with some ivory for the brighter highlights. And I'm now just adding some rusty streaking. Returning to the squad, here I'm just picking out the skull on Echo's chest with a pale grey. I'm now gluing them down to the bases, and you can find a link to a separate video showing my approach to painting them in the video description. I then chose to add a few additional pieces of cork rock before adding some finishing touches. Here I'm just picking out the studs on Echo's head with some grey. And I'm darkening one or two select panels of the armour with some thinned dark neutral grey. We can freely add some additional scratchy highlights. I also chose to add some touches of colour to the console. Here I'm tinting the screen with some emerald green. And then painting the line firstly in white. Followed with some fluorescent green pigments by Hera Models and a little tidying up. Finally, I chose to lighten up the backpacks with some additional dry brushing to more closely match the look from the show. Then adding some additional red detailing. And if you want to add some little lights, we can do so once again with an undercoat of pure white, followed with some fluorescent tones. This is the Hera Models dark red mixed with some red orange. And now some touches of blue. This just adds a nice bit of visual spice to the rear of the models. I'm now just adding one or two final scratches to the armour. And this completes Clone Force 99. Thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the episode and found some of the ideas useful. As usual, you can find full paint and product lists in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online. My deepest thanks go to my kind patrons for funding this work. I really couldn't do it without them. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Star Wars Shatterpoint. Happy painting!